3 days before her wedding, the man she had loved for 3 years looked straight at the woman carrying his child and said coldly, "I'd rather sleep in my truck than marry someone as poor as you." With that single sentence, he took everything from her. Her fiancé walked away. Their wedding savings were gone, and the baby growing inside her lost a father before it was even born. But Sophie Callahan's tragedy was not the saddest one. Somewhere else in the same city lived a man who possessed billions of dollars. Everyone believed Samuel Hastings had everything. No one knew that for 20 long years the only thing he truly wanted was to find the mother who had disappeared from his life. One had lost everything because she was poor. The other had everything yet lived with an emptiness money could never fill. Two completely different lives, destined to cross paths on one rainy night. When Sophie found an elderly woman dying outside a hospital, she had only one envelope of money left, the last savings, meant to keep herself and her unborn baby alive. If she gave that money away, she wouldn't even have enough to pay her rent. If she walked away, no one would blame her. But Sophie made the choice no one else would. And that single decision led to a shocking offer that changed her life forever. "You saved my mother. Now let me take care of you and your baby for the rest of your lives." What Sophie never knew, the homeless old woman everyone in the hospital laughed at, was the long-lost mother of the most powerful billionaire in the city. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now, and which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. You actually thought I was going to marry you. Look at you. Look at this apartment. I'd rather sleep in my truck than spend one more night pretending this is a life. The words fell out of Kyle Rourke's mouth like stones dropped into still water, and for a long moment, Sophie Callahan simply stood there in the narrow kitchen doorway, one hand pressed flat against her stomach, waiting for the ripples to stop. They did not stop. They never would, not really, not even years later, though. On this particular night, she did not yet know that. The apartment was small and cold, the kind of cold that Kansas City winters carried in through window frames that no longer sealed right, no matter how much weather stripping Sophie pressed into the cracks with her own tired fingers. A single space heater rattled in the corner, doing its best against a draft it could never fully defeat. 3 days from now, Sophie was supposed to be a bride. The dress hung behind the bedroom door in a plastic garment bag borrowed from a cousin, taken in at the waist by Sophie herself with a needle and thread, because there had been no money left over for a seamstress. There had been no money left over for very much at all. What little Sophie earned scrubbing floors and stripping soiled linens on the night shift at Mercy Grace General Hospital went first to rent, then to the small folder of cash tucked beneath a loose floorboard that she and Kyle had called, with more hope than sense, their future. That folder was gone. Sophie had already looked. "Kyle." Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "I'm having your baby." "That's exactly the problem." He said it flatly, almost bored, the duffel bag already slung over one shoulder, his boots already by the door, as though he had rehearsed this exit 100 times in his head before ever finding the courage to perform it. "You think I don't know what that means, diapers? Formula. You crying every night because we can't pay the light bill. I didn't sign up to spend the rest of my life, poor Sophie. I watched my own dad do that. I'm not doing it. So you're just leaving. Tonight. 3 days before the wedding. I'm leaving before it's too late to leave." He finally looked at her, and there was no softness left in his face, none of the boy who had once brought her convenience store roses because it was all he could afford and told her they were better than the expensive kind because he'd picked them out himself. "Someone smarter than me would have done this months ago." The door closed behind him with a sound so ordinary, so quiet, that Sophie would spend a long time afterward marveling at how something that small could end, something that large. No shouting, no slamming. Just the soft click of a latch, and then the apartment was hers alone. Hers, and the baby's hers, and the cold air pushing through the window seams. Hers, and the sudden suffocating silence where another person's breathing used to be. She did not cry. Not yet. She had learned somewhere in the long years of scraping by that crying was a luxury that had to be scheduled, penciled in between shifts, because Mercy Grace General Hospital did not care whether the woman pushing its floor buffer down the east corridor had just watched her entire future walk out the door with a duffel bag over its shoulder. The hospital only cared that the floors were clean by 6 in the morning. So Sophie changed into her uniform. She splashed cold water on her face at the bathroom sink, stared for a moment too long at her own reflection. A young woman, 26 years old, cheekbones a little too sharp from a diet of ramen and gas station coffee, eyes red-rimmed but dry. And then she walked the 11 blocks on the hospital because the bus fare too had lived inside that missing folder of cash. The wind off the river cut through her thin coat, like it had a personal grievance against her. By the time she reached the loading dock entrance, her hands had gone numb inside the dollar store gloves with the hole worn through one thumb, and she had to press them against the warm brick wall of the building for almost a minute before she trusted them enough to badge herself in. Inside, the fluorescent lights of Mercy Grace General buzzed the same tired hum they always did. Denise Kowalski was already waiting by the supply closet, arms crossed, watch tapped meaningfully with one manicured nail. "You're 4 minutes late, Callahan. I'm sorry. I don't need the story." Denise's eyes swept over her quick and cutting the way they always did, cataloging every visible flaw as if Sophie's worth could be tallied up like inventory. "Let me guess. Fiancé trouble. You've had that look on your face for a week." Sophie said nothing. There was no version of the truth she wanted to hand over to Denise Kowalski, who collected other people's misfortunes the way some women collected gossip magazines, flipping through them for entertainment and then setting them aside. "Whatever it is, leave it at the door." Denise continued, already turning to walk away, tossing the words back over her shoulder like scraps. "This isn't a support group. You're here to mop, not to fall apart. God knows you're barely keeping up as it is, and now you're going to be doing it with a baby hanging off you in a few months. I don't know how you people expect the rest of us to carry the slack." "You people." Sophie let the phrase land somewhere deep and did not let it show on her face. She had grown skilled at that, at holding her expression steady, while something inside her cracked quietly, privately, the way ice cracks beneath a frozen river, long before anyone standing on the surface hears it. The next several hours passed the way they always did, mop bucket, industrial cleaner. The particular ache that settled into her lower back by 2 in the morning, her feet swelling inside shoes that had been resoled twice already because new ones were not in the budget. Not this month, not any month in the foreseeable future. She emptied trash bins overflowing with the debris of other people's emergencies. She scrubbed a spill of dried blood from the corridor outside the trauma bay without letting herself think too hard about what it meant. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, alone in the family waiting room with a mop and the low blue light of a vending machine for company, she finally allowed herself 30 seconds, no more, to press both hands over her face and let shoulders shake silent before straightening up, wiping her eyes with the back of one glove and finishing the floor. By the time the sun came up gray and reluctant over the parking garage, Sophie Callahan had lost her fiancé, her savings, and the wedding dress hanging behind a door she no longer knew if she could afford to keep the lights on for. What she had not lost, what she would not let herself lose, no matter how many more Denise Kowalskis or Kyle Rourkes the world put in front of her, was the small, stubborn conviction buried somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the fear that she was still somehow a good person. That kindness still meant something. That there was still a reason to keep her heart open in a world that seemed determined again and again to teach her otherwise. She did not know it yet, walking home into the cold gray morning with her hand resting once more against the small, quiet swell of her stomach. But that conviction, that refusal to let bitterness win, was about to change the entire course of her life and the life of a man she had not yet met in ways neither of them could have imagined. "Get that thing away from the entrance before somebody trips over her. We are not a homeless shelter, Callahan." The security guard's voice cracked through the wet night air like a slap, and Sophie Callahan froze halfway across the loading dock, rain sliding down the back of her collar, her eyes fixed on the small, crumpled shape lying against the brick wall beside the ambulance bay. For one terrible second she thought the guard was talking about a pile of discarded linens. Then the shape moved. A thin arm lifted an inch off the wet concrete, fingers curling weakly against the rain, and Sophie understood all at once that she was looking at a woman, an old woman. Small and folded in on herself, wrapped in a coat, so threadbare it had gone the color of dishwater, her white hair plastered flat against a face the color of ash. Her lips had a bluish tint that Sophie recognized from her hospital training as something dangerous, something that could not wait. "She's burning up," Sophie said, already crouching, already pressing the back of her glove to the woman's forehead. "She needs to be inside. She needs to be somebody else's problem," the guard muttered, but he did not move to stop Sophie when she slid both arms beneath the stranger's shoulders and knees, and with the strength that came from months of hauling supply carts, twice her own weight lifted her. The rain came down harder as Sophie carried her toward the sliding doors of the emergency department, the old woman's head lolling against her shoulder so light it frightened her, as though there was almost nothing left of her to carry. Inside, under the flat white light of the waiting room, a triage nurse named Carla looked up from her computer screen with an expression that had already decided the answer before Sophie had finished asking the question. "Ma'am, does she have insurance? A photo ID? Anything?" "No. I found her outside. She's got a fever. She's disoriented. Her lips are turning blue. Then she needs to go to county. We can't admit an indigent patient without. She might die on the way to county." Sophie's voice came out sharper than she intended, sharp enough that a few heads turned in the waiting room, sharp enough that Carla's mouth pressed into a thin, unhappy line. "Please, just look at her." It took almost 10 full minutes of arguing, of Sophie refusing to set the old woman down in a plastic chair, like a piece of unclaimed luggage, before a doctor finally agreed to examine her in a curtained bay near the back, muttering the whole way about liability and unpaid bills that would land eventually on somebody's desk. The fever, once they took it, read a number so high the nurse repeated it twice as if she did not trust the thermometer. An IV line went into a thin, papery arm. A blanket warmed in some machine down the hall was tucked around a body that seemed to be shivering and burning at the same time. Sophie stayed. Nobody asked her to, and in the sideways glances of the staff moving in and out of the curtain, it was clear that nobody particularly wanted her to either. But she stayed, holding one small dry hand between both of her own, murmuring nothing in particular, just a steady, low stream of sound meant to say, "Without words, you are not alone in this room." It was almost an hour later, in the fluorescent corridor outside billing, that the real trouble began. "I need $420 up front," the billing clerk said, not unkindly but with the flat, practiced tone of someone who had delivered the same sentence 1,000 times before. "That's just to cover tonight. If she needs to be admitted, there will be more." Sophie did not have $420. She had, as of 3 days ago, the last of her wedding savings, $1,100, folded into a bank envelope in the bottom of her coat pocket money that had once been meant for a florist and a rented hall and a future that no longer existed. She had been carrying it with her since Kyle left, unable to decide what to do with a fund for a life that had disappeared, unwilling to spend it, unwilling to let it go. She pulled the envelope out now and counted the bills into the clerk's hand without letting herself think too hard about what she was doing. The way a person crosses a cold river fast before the shock of the water can make them turn back. There. That should cover it. Keep whatever's left toward what she owes. Behind her in the hallway, laughter rippled through a cluster of off-duty staff who had gathered by the vending machines, drawn by the small spectacle, the way people are always drawn to somebody else's disaster. "She's paying for a stranger off the street," one of them said, not bothering to lower her voice, "and she can't even keep her own fiancé around. That's rich." Denise Kowalski, arms crossed, leaned against the wall with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has just been handed fresh material. "You know what your problem is, Callahan. You think being a doormat is the same thing as being a good person. Nobody's going to remember this. That woman won't even know your name by morning. You'll just be broke and pregnant and alone, same as you were yesterday, except now you're also broke and pregnant and alone and stupid." Sophie's face burned, the heat of it rising up her neck into her cheeks. And for one long, dizzying moment, the corridor seemed to tilt sideways, the fluorescent light swimming, the laughter pressing in from every direction until it was hard to tell where the sound ended, and her own pulse began. She thought of the empty envelope in her pocket. She thought of the wedding dress still hanging behind a door at home. She thought with a kind of numb, distant horror that she had just spent the last of everything she had on a woman whose name she did not even know. And still, when she turned back toward the curtained bay, she did not regret it. Not really. Not in the place underneath the fear, the place where something steadier than logic had already made its decision. The old woman's eyes opened partway as Sophie slipped back into the bay and settled into the plastic chair beside the bed. They were pale blue, clouded slightly with age and fever, but there was something sharp and alert moving behind them, something that seemed to take Sophie in fully, the exhausted, small curve of her stomach, the wet strands of hair stuck to her forehead, and understand all of it at once. "You didn't have to do that," the woman whispered, her voice thin as paper. "I know," Sophie said. "They're right, you know. Out there." Laughing. A faint, tired smile crossed the old woman's cracked lips. "The world doesn't reward people like us for being kind. It just uses it against us." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, watching the slow rise and fall of the blanket over the woman's chest, listening to the beep of the monitor keeping careful time beside them. Maybe, she finally said. But I'd still rather be the kind of person who helps than the kind who walks past. Even if nobody ever finds out. Even if it costs me everything I've got. The old woman's hand found hers again, weak but certain fingers curling around Sophie's, with a grip that seemed for just a moment far stronger than her fragile body should have allowed. Then you and I, she murmured, her eyes drifting closed again. As the fever pulled her back under, are going to get along just fine. Outside the curtain, the rain kept falling against the ambulance bay doors, steady and indifferent, washing the parking lot clean under the sodium lights. Sophie did not know, sitting there in the small hours of that long cold night with an empty envelope in her pocket and a stranger's hand in hers, that the woman beside her carried a name that would one day be spoken in boardrooms and headlines across the entire country. She only knew that the woman was alive, and warm now instead of blue-lipped and shivering on wet concrete, and that whatever came next, she would not take back a single dollar of what she had given. Well, would you look at that? Still playing nurse for strangers, Sophie. Guess some things never change. The voice cut through the recovery bay like a blade through paper, and Sophie Callahan's whole body went rigid before she even turned around. She knew that voice. She had fallen asleep to that voice for 3 years. She had once believed she would spend the rest of her life listening to that voice say good morning. Kyle Rourke stood at the foot of the gurney he had just wheeled in, still dressed in his paramedic uniform, the radio on his shoulder crackling faintly with dispatch chatter. Beside him stood a young woman in scrubs, pretty and unbothered, her hand resting comfortably in the crook of his arm, as though she had every right to be there, as though she had not stepped still warm into the exact space Sophie had vacated 3 days earlier. Kyle. Sophie's voice came out flat, carefully flat, the way a person speaks when they are holding something very heavy, very still. Didn't expect to see you here. He glanced past her toward the pale, sleeping figure of Dorothy in the hospital bed, and something like amusement flickered across his face. Who's this? Another stray you dragged in off the street, God, Sophie. You never learn, do you? She was sick. She needed help. And you paid for it. Don't lie, I know you. I know exactly what you did. Kyle's laugh was short and ugly, and he turned deliberately to include the small cluster of staff who had gathered near the nurse's station, drawn as always by the promise of a scene. You want to know why I really left her? He said louder now, his voice pitched for an audience. Because 3 days before our wedding she tells me she's pregnant, and instead of being scared like a normal person, instead of figuring out how we were going to survive, she's out here giving away every dollar we had to homeless strangers. I looked at her and I thought, I am not spending the next 18 years broke, because this woman can't say no to a sob story. The young woman on his arm let out a soft, uncomfortable laugh, the kind that did not know whether it was supposed to be scandalized or entertained. Kyle. Sophie's hands had begun to shake, and she pressed them flat against her thighs, willing them still. Please stop. No, I think people should know. He took a step closer, and Sophie caught underneath the hospital antiseptic smell, the same cologne he used to wear on their date nights, the smell that had once meant safety and now meant something closer to nausea. I think they should know that the woman standing here 6 months pregnant, broke, about to lose her apartment because she can't make rent alone. I think they should know she had over $1,000 3 days ago. Wedding money. Our future. And she gave every last cent of it to some woman off the street instead of using it to survive. He shook his head, almost pitying. You're going to end up on the street right next to her, Sophie. Mark my words. Some people just can't help themselves. The corridor had gone very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped its steady, indifferent rhythm, and somewhere further off, a gurney wheel squeaked against the linoleum. But around Sophie herself there was only a terrible ringing silence, the kind that comes right before a person's knees give out beneath them. She felt the blood drain from her face, felt the fluorescent lights above her swim and blur, felt every eye in that corridor turn toward her the way spotlights turn toward the one figure left standing on an empty stage. She had absorbed insults before. She had built over the last difficult months a kind of scar tissue against them. Denise's sharp tongue, the whispered comments of coworkers, the small daily cruelties of people who had decided without knowing anything real about her, exactly what kind of woman she was. But there was something different about hearing it from Kyle. Kyle, who had once known the actual truth of her, who had seen her cry over her mother's old recipe box, who had held her hand through 2 miscarried job interviews, who had promised in the particular voice people use only for promises they intend to keep, that he would never let her feel alone again. To hear that same voice turn her kindness into a punchline in front of strangers in the very hospital where she scrubbed floors 5 nights a week was a different, deeper kind of wound. It reached down into a part of her that Denise's cruelty had never been able to touch. Are you finished? Sophie asked, and she was surprised to hear that her voice, though thin, did not break. Kyle blinked, thrown, as though he had expected tears rather than the question. I gave that money to a woman who was dying on the sidewalk outside this hospital. Sophie continued, quiet but steady, each word placed with the careful precision of someone laying stones across a river. I don't regret it. I will never regret it. You left me 3 days before our wedding with nothing, Kyle, and you want to stand here and lecture me about what I do with what little I had left. That's not concern. That's cruelty wearing concern's clothes, and I think everyone standing here can tell the difference. For a moment, nobody spoke. The young woman on Kyle's arm shifted her weight, suddenly very interested in the floor. Kyle's jaw tightened, some of the smugness draining out of his face, replaced by the particular embarrassment of a man who has just discovered his audience is not entirely on his side. Whatever, he muttered, finally tugging his partner toward the exit. Enjoy your charity case. I hope it was worth it. He was gone. A moment later, the automatic doors sighing shut behind him, and the corridor slowly began to breathe again. The small crowd dispersing, murmuring, one or two staff members glancing at Sophie with something that might have been sympathy and might have simply been curiosity satisfied. Sophie did not move for almost a full minute. She stood very still in the middle of the hallway with her hand pressed against the small, hard curve of her stomach, waiting for the shaking in her legs to pass, waiting for the humiliation sitting hot and heavy in her chest to loosen its grip even slightly. It did not loosen much. It rarely did these days. It was the faint rustle of movement from the recovery bay that finally pulled her back into her own body. She turned to find Dorothy awake, pale but alert, her cloudy blue eyes fixed on Sophie, with an expression of quiet, fierce tenderness that no stranger had any business wearing. Come here, child, Dorothy said, her voice a thin thread of sound, and Sophie crossed the small distance and sank into the chair beside the bed, letting the old woman's frail hand close around hers. You heard all that. Every word. Dorothy's grip tightened, surprisingly strong for someone so small and so sick. And I want you to listen to me now, because I don't have the strength to say this twice. She paused, gathering breath, her eyes never leaving Sophie's face. Good hearts always find each other, sweetheart. Always. It might not look like it tonight, standing in this hallway with everybody staring at you like you're the fool in the story. But the world has a way of circling back on people like that man who just walked out of here. And it has a way of circling back on people like you too, only it circles back with something worth having. Sophie tried to smile and mostly managed it, though her eyes had gone hot and wet despite everything she had already told herself about scheduling her tears for later. Don't you let anybody tell you your kindness was wasted, Dorothy whispered, her eyelids beginning to droop again as the fever pulled at her once more. Not that man. Not the ones laughing in the hallway. Not even the tired, frightened voice in your own head telling you that you should have known better. You didn't do anything wrong tonight, child. You did the only thing worth doing. Outside the window, the rain had finally begun to ease, thinning into a soft, steady drizzle against the glass. And somewhere far beyond the hospital walls, in a part of the city Sophie Callahan had never once had reason to visit, a phone would ring before the week was out, carrying with it a name, a fortune, and a truth about the woman sleeping in that hospital bed that neither of them could yet imagine. You want to take her home. To your place, Callahan. That is the single most reckless thing I have heard in 11 years of discharge planning. You don't know this woman. She could be dangerous. She could be sick with something worse than a fever. She could rob you blind in your sleep if you've even got anything left worth stealing. The discharge coordinator, a heavy-set man named Roger with a clipboard he tapped against his palm like a gavel, delivered the words without once looking up from his paperwork, as though Sophie Callahan's plan were simply one more box to check off before lunch. Around them, the hallway outside the recovery bay carried on its usual indifferent rhythm, carts, rattling pagers, chirping a custodian, mopping a spill 3 doors down, utterly unmoved by the small, quiet decision Sophie was trying to make. She has nowhere else to go, Sophie said. You said it yourselves. No ID, no family on record, no shelter bed available until at least next week. What am I supposed to do? Let her go back out into the cold? That's not your problem to solve. Roger finally glanced up, not unkindly but with the flat weariness of a man who had watched 100 well-meaning people burn themselves out trying to fix things that were, in his professional opinion, unfixable. You're pregnant. You're alone. You work nights scrubbing floors for barely above minimum wage. And you want to bring home a woman you met 12 hours ago because you feel sorry for her. That's not compassion, sweetheart. That's a woman trying to save someone else because she can't figure out how to save herself. The words landed harder than Sophie expected, mostly because some small, exhausted part of her suspected they might be true. She thought of her own empty apartment, the cold seeping through the window seams, the wedding dress still hanging behind a door she had not had the strength to open in 3 days. She thought of how easy it would be to simply nod sign the discharge form and let the hospital system carry Dorothy away to wherever broken. Nameless people were carried when nobody claimed them. She did not nod. "I have a spare blanket and a couch," Sophie said quietly. "That's more than she has right now. I'm taking her home." Roger sighed, the particular sigh of a man documenting a decision he considered a mistake, scrawled something on his clipboard, and walked away without further argument because in the end it was not his life to spend. The taxi ride to Sophie's apartment cost more than she wanted to admit money, pulled from the very last thin cushion of what remained in her checking account. But Dorothy sat wrapped in a hospital blanket in the back seat, watching the gray Kansas City streets slide past the window with an expression of quiet, careful attention, as though she were memorizing the route, or perhaps comparing it against some other route from a much older memory. The apartment when they reached it was small and plain and a little embarrassing in the unforgiving light of a stranger's gaze. A mismatched couch, a kitchenette with a single working burner, the space heater still rattling faithfully in the corner. But Dorothy looked around it the way some people look at a cathedral. "It's warm," she said, simply lowering herself onto the couch with a soft, grateful exhale. You have no idea what that word means until you've gone without it. Over the following days, something unexpected began to take root between them. Dorothy, once the fever finally broke for good, revealed herself to be sharp-tongued and quietly funny, prone to humming old country songs under her breath, while she sat by the window watching the street below with a patience that seemed at times to be waiting for something specific. She insisted, despite Sophie's protests, on doing what small chores her strength allowed, folding the laundry, wiping down the counters, and in the evenings after Sophie returned from her shift with her feet swollen and her back aching, Dorothy would already have a pot of weak, reheated coffee waiting along with a story or two from a life she otherwise kept carefully vague. "Where's your family?" Sophie asked one evening, curled at the far end of the couch with her hand resting on the small, steady kick of the baby inside her. "Somebody must be looking for you." Something moved across Dorothy's face, then a shadow, quick and deep, gone almost before Sophie could name it. "I had a family once," she said finally. "A long time ago. Things happened. People get lost from each other, sometimes, child, in ways that aren't anybody's fault, and in ways that are entirely somebody's fault. I've stopped trying to sort out which is which. It doesn't change the losing." She would not say more than that, no matter how gently Sophie tried to draw the thread further, and Sophie, who understood something about wounds too tender to be handled by strangers, learned to let the silence sit undisturbed. It was on the fourth night that Dorothy began the blanket. She found a half-used skein of pale yellow yarn and a bag of donated hospital craft supplies Sophie had brought home on a whim, and from that evening forward her hands were rarely still, needles clicking softly in the lamplight while some old half-forgotten pattern emerged beneath her, fingers row by row. "It's for the baby," Dorothy said simply when Sophie finally asked. "Every child should have something made with somebody's own two hands, something that says before they've even taken their first breath that somebody out there was thinking of them." Sophie sat beside her that night longer than usual, watching the yarn loop and pull, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight since the morning Kyle walked out the door. For the first time in longer than she could easily remember, the apartment did not feel like a place she was simply enduring. It felt finally, briefly, like a home. It was 2 nights later that the fever returned low and sudden, catching them both off guard in the deep hours past midnight. Sophie woke to the sound of Dorothy murmuring in her sleep, restless, her thin hands plucking at the edge of the blanket she had not yet finished. "Sammy," Dorothy whispered, her voice thick with fever and something that sounded even in sleep like grief, worn smooth from years of handling. "Sammy, baby, where did you go?" I looked everywhere. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, I never meant to." Sophie sat up quickly, pressing a cool cloth to the old woman's forehead, murmuring low reassurances the way she had learned to do for frightened patients on the hospital floor. And slowly, gradually, Dorothy's breathing eased, the murmuring fading back into ordinary, exhausted sleep. By morning, she remembered nothing of it, or claimed not to, brushing off Sophie's gentle questions with a small, tired wave of her hand. But Sophie remembered. She lay awake long after Dorothy had drifted off again, turning the name over in her mind, Sammy turning over too. The particular weight of grief in the old woman's voice, a grief that did not sound like the ordinary sorrow of a wandering, lonely life, but something sharper, something that had never once been allowed to heal. She did not know, could not have known, lying there in the dim light of her small apartment with the space heater ticking faithfully against the winter cold, that the name would come to matter more than almost anything else in her life. She only knew, watching the unfinished yellow blanket rise and fall gently with Dorothy's breathing, that whatever burden this woman carried, whatever loss lived, folded up quietly inside her. Sophie intended to keep offering her the thing she still had left to give now that the wedding money and the wedding dress and the future she had once imagined were all gone. A roof, a warm room, a place, however small, however uncertain, where a person who had been lost for a very long time might finally briefly rest. Are you telling me a woman just showed up at your door claiming to represent a billionaire, and you actually believed her, Sophie, honestly? First it's a homeless stranger sleeping on your couch, now it's some story about limousines and lost mothers. Do you hear yourself? Denise Kowalski's laugh rang sharp and short across the break room, bouncing off the vending machines and the row of employee lockers. And for a moment, Sophie Callahan simply stood there with her hand still gripping the strap of her bag, too tired and too raw to summon the energy to defend herself. It had been that kind of morning already, long before she had even walked through the hospital doors, the kind that left a person feeling as though the ground beneath them had quietly, without warning, become something else entirely. It had started 3 hours earlier in the gray, uncertain light just after sunrise. Sophie had woken to an apartment gone strangely, wrongly quiet. No click of knitting needles, no soft hum of an old country song drifting from the direction of the couch. She had known even before she pushed open the bedroom door that something had changed. Dorothy was gone. The couch cushions had been straightened with careful, deliberate hands, the borrowed hospital blanket folded into a neat square at one end. Beside it, laid out with the same careful attention, sat the unfinished yellow blanket needles still threaded through the last incomplete row, and a single folded sheet of paper torn from the small notepad Sophie kept by the phone. Thank you, my dear. You gave me more than you know. I have somewhere I need to be now. Please don't worry about me, D. Sophie had read it 4 times, standing barefoot on the cold kitchen tile, before the reality of it fully settled into her chest. She had told herself, gathering her things for work with hands that would not quite stop trembling, that Dorothy was a grown woman, that she owed Sophie nothing, that perhaps this was simply how her strange, quiet, private life had always worked, arriving without warning, leaving the same way. She told herself this all the way to the hospital, and she was still telling herself this unconvincingly when she stepped off the elevator and found a woman waiting for her outside the staff entrance who did not belong there at all. The woman wore a coat that had clearly cost more than everything in Sophie's closet combined, and she stood beside a black car so long and so polished that it looked parked against the cracked curb of the hospital's side street, like something beamed in from an entirely different city. Sophie Callahan, yes. Sophie's stomach had already begun to tighten with a wary, uncertain instinct. My name is Priya Anand. I work for Samuel Hastings. The woman said the name the way people say things they expect to be immediately recognized, and when Sophie's face remained blank, she added gently, of Hastings Home and Hardware. Even Sophie, who did not follow business news and had never once in her life had reason to think about who owned the hardware chain whose familiar red and white signs dotted every strip mall in the metro area, felt a small jolt of recognition at the name. It was the kind of name printed on billboards along the highway. The kind of name attached occasionally to news stories about factory openings and charitable donations, stories Sophie had skimmed past on her phone during 15-minute breaks, without ever imagining they might one day have anything to do with her own small life. I don't understand, Sophie said. What does any of that have to do with me? Priya's expression softened just slightly into something that looked almost like sympathy. Do you know a woman named Dorothy Elderly? No identification. You brought her in 3 nights ago and paid her admission fee out of your own pocket. The ground, Sophie would think later, had a way of shifting under a person's feet at the exact moments they least expected it. That's her name, Sophie said slowly. I don't know her last name. She never told me. Hastings, Priya said quietly. Her name is Dorothy Hastings. She is Samuel Hastings' mother. She has been missing for almost 20 years. For a long moment, Sophie could not make her mouth produce any sound at all. The parking lot around her seemed to tilt and swim the ordinary morning noise of the hospital. A delivery truck idling, a pair of nurses, laughing over coffee near the entrance, receding into something distant and muffled as though she had been submerged suddenly underwater. 20 years, she finally managed. Mr. Hastings' company runs a charitable initiative called the Second Chance Fund. Priya explained, her voice, patient now, clearly practiced at delivering news that landed like this. Among other things, it partners with hospitals across several states to flag unidentified patients whose medical profile might match a database of missing persons his family has maintained privately for a very long time. When your payment record and the admission notes came through the system 2 nights ago, it triggered a match. We've spent the last 36 hours confirming it. There's no question. The woman you took into your home is Mr. Hastings' mother. Sophie thought with a sudden dizzying clarity of the name Dorothy had whispered in her sleep, thick with fever and old grief. Sammy. I looked everywhere. I'm sorry. She left this morning, Sophie said, her voice thinner than she wanted it to be. I don't know where she went. I woke up and she was just… She's safe, Priya said quickly, gently, seeing the panic rising in Sophie's face. She went to him directly last night on her own before we even completed the search. Mr. Hastings called me himself at 4 a.m. He asked me to come and find you personally to thank you, and to ask whether you would be willing to come speak with him. Sophie's mind, still trying to catch up to the shape of what was happening, snagged on something smaller, something that felt in that moment more urgent than billionaires or missing mothers or long black cars parked outside a hospital, that had never in its history seen one before. I used every dollar I had left to pay for her admission, Sophie said quietly, almost to herself. I don't regret it. I want you to know that whatever this is, I don't regret a cent of it. Something shifted in Priya's carefully composed expression, then something that looked for just a moment genuinely moved. Mr. Hastings knows exactly what you did, Miss Callahan. That is precisely why he wants to see you. It was that story, stripped down and stumbled through in the hospital break room an hour later, that had earned Sophie the full weight of Denise Kowalski's disbelief. A car. Outside our hospital. For you. Denise shook her head, arms crossed, clearly enjoying herself. Sophie, I've worked here 9 years and I've never once seen a car like that outside these doors. And you're telling me it showed up for the janitor who took some homeless woman home with her. You sure this isn't some kind of scam? People prey on women in your situation. You? No. Desperate. Pregnant. Alone. I know how it sounds, Sophie admitted quietly, because she did. Because some small, exhausted, self-protective part of her had spent the entire drive to work turning over the very same suspicion, testing it for weaknesses, half expecting it to collapse under its own improbability. But it had not collapsed. Priya had left a business card embossed and heavy, in a way that ordinary paper never was, along with an address and a time. And beneath the disbelief and the exhaustion and the low persistent ache of everything she had lost in the last week, Sophie felt something else stirring, small, cautious almost, afraid to name itself. Hope. She thought of Dorothy's hands moving steadily over pale yellow yarn in the lamplight. She thought of the whispered name Sammy and the grief that had lived underneath it, deep and old and unhealed. She thought of the folded note left behind on the coffee table, thanking her for something Dorothy had insisted, even in a handwritten scrap of paper that Sophie had not fully understood the size of. You gave me more than you know. Whatever waited for her at the end of that long black car ride, Sophie understood, standing there in the fluorescent hum of the break room with Denise's skepticism still ringing in her ears, that she was about to find out exactly what those words had meant. You can wait by the gate. Deliveries and staff don't come up the main drive. The estate guard did not even glance up from his clipboard as he said it, waving a dismissive hand toward a side gravel path, half hidden behind a row of clipped hedges, and Sophie Callahan stood frozen for a moment beside the black car that had carried her nearly 40 minutes outside Kansas City, feeling her cheeks heat with an old familiar shame, the particular sting of being sorted at a glance into the category of people who did not belong. She's not staff, Priya said crisply, stepping around the car before Sophie could speak. She's Mr. Hastings' personal guest. Open the main gate, please. The guard's expression flickered, recalibrated, and the heavy iron gate swung inward a moment later with a low mechanical groan, revealing a driveway that stretched so far ahead of them that Sophie briefly mistook it for a public road. Manicured lawns rolled away on either side, dotted with old oak trees whose bare winter branches had been strung here and there with small white lights that would come evening. Turned the whole approach into something out of a film Sophie might once have watched curled up on a second-hand couch with a bowl of cheap popcorn. The house itself, when it finally came into view, was less a house than a small mountain of stone and glass, its windows catching the pale winter sun and throwing it back in sharp, dazzling fragments. Sophie's hand found the small curve of her stomach without her quite deciding to put it there, an old unconscious habit whenever the world tilted too far into the unfamiliar. You're allowed to be nervous, Priya said, gently watching her. Most people are the first time. I don't exactly have anything appropriate to wear to a place like this, Sophie admitted, glancing down at her worn coat, the same one that had failed so completely against the winter wind on the night. Everything changed. Mr. Hastings won't care what you're wearing, Priya said, and something in her voice, quiet and certain, made Sophie look up. Trust me. The front doors opened before they had even reached the top step, and a small running figure crossed the marble entryway, with a speed that seemed impossible for a woman who had been half frozen and feverish on a hospital gurney less than a week earlier. "There you are." Dorothy's voice broke on the words, and then her thin arms were around Sophie, gripping her with a strength that had nothing left of the fragile, shivering woman from the ambulance bay. "I'm sorry I left the way I did. I had to see him. I had to know for certain before I let myself hope." "You're okay," Sophie whispered, holding her back just as tightly, some tight, worried knot in her chest finally beginning to loosen. "You're really okay. Better than okay, child." Dorothy pulled back, beaming, her eyes bright and wet at once. "Come. There's someone who has been waiting all morning to meet you and driving poor Priya half to distraction, asking whether the car had left yet." He was standing at the top of the wide staircase when Sophie finally looked up, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a plain gray sweater that looked on second glance quietly expensive, in the way that simple things sometimes were when money stopped needing to announce itself. But it was his boots that caught her attention first. Scuffed and worn at the toe, clearly years old, entirely out of place beneath the polish of everything around him. Samuel Hastings came down the stairs two at a time, and up close he did not carry himself the way Sophie had braced for. There was no cold appraisal in his eyes, no flicker of the guarded amusement she had half expected from a man who employed people to open his gates for him. Instead, when he reached the bottom step and stopped in front of her, his expression was something closer to raw, unguarded gratitude, so plain and unpolished that it startled her. "Miss Callahan." His voice was quieter than she expected, a little rough around the edges, as though he had not fully composed himself yet for the conversation. "I don't." He stopped, exhaled, tried again. "I've rehearsed about a dozen different things to say to you since 4 o'clock this morning, and every single one of them feels too small now that you're actually standing here." "It's just Sophie," she said, because it seemed important suddenly to say something ordinary in the middle of all this extraordinary. "Sophie." He said her name carefully, as though testing the weight of it. "You gave my mother everything you had. A stranger on the worst night of your own life, from what I understand." His jaw tightened briefly, and something older and more painful moved behind his eyes before he caught it and folded it away again. "I've spent almost 20 years and more money than I know how to count trying to find her. And in the end, it wasn't a private investigator or a database that brought her home. It was a pregnant hospital janitor who didn't have $400 to spare giving it to her anyway. She needed help," Sophie said simply. "I wasn't thinking about who she was. I was just thinking that nobody should die on a sidewalk in the rain." Something in Sam's face cracked open at that, brief and unguarded. And for a moment, the billionaire standing in front of her looked more than anything else like a boy who had been waiting a very long time to hear that somebody had finally been kind to his mother when he could not be there to do it himself. "Let me give you something," he said, recovering, gesturing toward the wide sitting room off the entryway where several large boxes wrapped in gold ribbon had been arranged on a low table. "It isn't nearly enough. Nothing would be enough. But please, let me try." Sophie followed him into the room, and Dorothy trailed close behind, practically vibrating with excitement as Sam lifted the lid of the largest box to reveal, nestled in tissue paper, a small velvet case. Inside sat a set of keys. "There's a car outside," Sam said. "It's yours. And there's more, a housing allowance, set up medical coverage for you and the baby, anything you need. I want to make sure you and your child never have to stand in a hospital hallway again wondering how you're going to pay a bill." Sophie stared at the keys for a long moment and then gently closed the lid of the case. "I can't take this." Sam blinked, clearly thrown. "Why not?" "Because I didn't help your mother because I wanted something in return," Sophie said, her voice steady even as her pulse raced beneath it. "If I take this now, it turns something real into something that looks like it was always about money. I need it not to be about that, especially now." She glanced briefly toward Dorothy. "Especially considering everything she's already given me just by being someone worth helping." For a long moment, Sam simply looked at her, and there was something in his expression. Surprise, certainly, but underneath it something quieter and more complicated. An old ache stirring awake that Sophie could not yet name. "You're refusing a car," he said finally, almost to himself, as though the sentence did not fully make sense to him even as he said it aloud. "Yes." Dorothy let out a soft, delighted laugh from the doorway, wiping at her eyes. "I told you, Sammy," she said. "I told you she was different." Sam did not correct the old childhood name, though something flickered across his face at the sound of it. Something Sophie could not read, gone as quickly as it had appeared. He simply looked at her a moment longer, his expression unguarded in a way she suspected did not happen often in this house, in this life, in whatever careful architecture of distance a man like him had likely built around himself over the years. Then at least he said finally, "Let me ask you to stay for dinner. Not as payment. just as he hesitated, searching for the word. As a thank you that doesn't come with keys attached. Sophie glanced at Dorothy, whose eyes were bright with a hope she did not bother to hide, and felt something in her own chest, cautious, unfamiliar, and entirely against her better judgment, begin very quietly to open. Okay, she said. Dinner. Just dinner. Neither of them could have known, standing in that vast marble entryway with the winter light slanting long and gold through the tall windows, how far that single small word was about to carry them both. You're worthless, you hear me, worthless. Your mother knew it too. That's why she ran. Not because of me, boy. Because of you. The words came from somewhere deep and old, a voice roughened by cigarettes and cheap whiskey, and for one disorienting moment, Sam Hastings was not a grown man standing alone in a locked room at midnight, but a 7-year-old boy, pressed into the corner of a narrow hallway on Cedar Street, flinching from a hand that never quite missed. He blinked and the voice receded, folding itself back into memory where it belonged, but his heart was still hammering, his palms still damp. 3 decades removed from the house that voice had once ruled. He had not meant to come up here tonight. Dinner with Sophie and his mother had gone longer than expected, easy in a way that surprised him, Dorothy laughing more freely than he had heard in the short week since her return. Sophie asking careful, genuine questions about the company, about Kansas City, about nothing in particular, filling the vast dining room with an ordinary warmth that the house rarely held. It was only after Sophie had gone up to the guest wing for the night, after his mother had finally drifted off in the chair by the fire, that Sam had found himself climbing the back staircase, drawn, as he sometimes still was on the hardest nights, to the one door in the entire estate he had never allowed a plaque-sposent decorator to touch. He did not hear Sophie's footsteps in the hallway behind him, until she was already standing in the doorway. I'm sorry, she said quickly, one hand still resting on the frame. I was looking for water. I took a wrong turn. I didn't mean to. She stopped, taking in the room properly for the first time, a narrow bed with a faded quilt, a shelf of small battered toy cars, a cracked photograph propped against the wall, torn cleanly down one side, so that only half a family remained visible in the frame. Sam, are you okay? He almost said yes. It was the answer he gave everyone reflexively, the way other men reached for a handshake. But something about the late hour, or the dinner that had gone easier than he expected, or simply the exhaustion of holding a single locked door shut inside himself for 20 years, made the reflex fail him. This was my room, he said instead. Before everything. Before Hastings' home and hardware, before any of it. My father kept the house after my mother left. I don't know why he never let anyone touch this room. Maybe it was easier to leave it exactly as it was than to admit anything had ever been different. Sophie did not move closer right away. She simply stood in the doorway, quiet, waiting, the way Sam realized with a small, sharp ache almost no one in his life had ever waited for him. People around him were quick to fill silences, quick to fix, quick to offer solutions dressed up as comfort. Sophie only waited. My father drank, Sam said, finally moving to sit on the edge of the narrow bed, the frame creaking under weight it had never been built to hold. Every night, some nights worse than others. When my mother disappeared, I was 7. He told me she left because she couldn't stand being married to a man with nothing, and because she couldn't stand being a mother to a boy who his voice caught, and he pressed the heel of his hand briefly against his eyes before continuing, who wasn't worth staying for. He said it so many times I stopped hearing it as an insult and started hearing it as a fact. Something true about the world, the way gravity is true. That's not true, Sophie said quietly, finally crossing the room to sit beside him close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. None of that is true, Sam. I know that now. Mostly. He gave a short, humorless laugh. I've built an entire company proving it, apparently. Every store I opened, every dollar I made, some part of me was still that kid on Cedar Street trying to prove to a woman who might not even be alive anymore that he was worth something after all. He shook his head slowly. It's a strange thing building an empire to answer a question nobody but a 7-year-old ever actually asked. Outside the small window, the winter wind moved through the bare oak trees lining the drive, and somewhere below, faint and distant, a clock chimed the hour. Sam glanced sideways at Sophie, bracing almost for the words people usually reached for in moments like this. She didn't mean it. She loved you. Really. You can't blame yourself. Words that, however well-intentioned, always managed to make him feel smaller rather than steadier, as though his pain were something to be argued out of rather than simply held. Sophie said none of those things. She reached over instead and took his hand, her fingers cool and steady around his, and said nothing at all for a long moment, letting the silence stretch out between them, unhurried and unafraid. I spent 3 days planning a wedding to a man who told me 3 days before it happened that I was too much trouble to stay for, she said finally quietly. I keep thinking there's some line I'm supposed to cross where that stops hurting. I haven't found it yet. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe you just learn to carry it differently. Something in Sam's chest loosened at that some old tightly wound thing finally allowing itself a fraction of slack. It was not comfort exactly what she offered him. It was recognition, the particular relief of discovering that another person understood a weight without needing it. Explained twice. I used to come up here sometimes, he admitted, after board meetings that went well. After the company hit numbers I used to think would finally make it stop the ache, I mean. It never stops. I just get better at not looking at it directly. Maybe it's not supposed to stop, Sophie said. Maybe it's supposed to just get a little quieter when enough people show you it isn't true. Sam turned to look at her, then really look at her, in the dim light of a room he had not let anyone else stand inside in over a decade. There was no pity in her expression, no careful management of his feelings, nothing that made him feel handled. There was only a steady open attention that asked nothing of him, and offered in its quiet way everything. Why did you stay? He asked. Just now. In the doorway. You could have turned around and gone back to your room and pretended you never saw any of this. Because I know what it costs to stand alone in a room full of your own worst memories, Sophie said simply. And I know what it's worth having somebody stay in the doorway instead of walking past it. Neither of them spoke again for a while after that. Sam sat with his elbows on his knees, staring at the cracked, torn photograph propped against the wall, half a family, a mother's arm visible at the very edge of the frame cut away from whatever had once stood beside her. And Sophie sat beside him, her hand still resting quietly in his, not pulling him forward, not urging him to feel better, simply present in the particular unglamorous way that real comfort so often turned out to be. It was well past midnight before either of them moved. When Sam finally rose to walk, Sophie back to the guest wing. Something had shifted between them that neither could yet name aloud. Not quite the giddy, easy warmth of the dinner table downstairs, but something steadier, something roots. At her door he paused. Thank you, he said, for not fixing it. Everyone always wants to fix it. Some things aren't broken, Sophie said gently. They're just carried. There's a difference. He watched her disappear inside, and stood for a long moment alone in the quiet hallway, the old house settling around him with its familiar creaks and silences. For the first time in longer than he could easily remember, the locked room down the hall did not feel quite so much like a wound he was guarding alone. It felt instead like something he had finally allowed another person to help him hold, and somewhere beneath the exhaustion of the long, unraveling night, Sam Hastings recognized with a kind of quiet astonishment that he was beginning to fall in love with the one person in his entire life who had never once asked him to be anything other than exactly what he was. Are you out of your mind? A pregnant stranger shows up out of nowhere, conveniently finds your missing mother, and a week later she's sleeping in your guest wing, and you're looking at her like she hung the moon. Wake up, Sam. This is exactly how it starts. This is exactly how they get you. Tommy Briggs did not raise his voice, which somehow made the words land harder than if he had shouted them. He said it the way a man says something he has rehearsed on the drive over pacing a slow, deliberate line across the width of Sam Hastings' study. His tie already loosened his jaw tight with the particular frustration of a person watching someone he loves walk toward a cliff edge in slow motion. Sam did not answer right away. He stood by the tall window overlooking the frost-dusted lawn, arms crossed, watching his own breath fog faintly against the cold glass, and for a long moment the only sound in the room was the low crackle of the fireplace and distant muffled thud of a door somewhere deep in the house. You don't know her, Tommy. Neither do you. Tommy stopped pacing, planting both hands flat on the edge of Sam's desk, leaning forward with the easy, unshakable familiarity of a man who had known Sam since they were two hungry kids, splitting a single gas station sandwich behind a strip mall dumpster back before either of them had a dollar to their name. I know you, though. 22 years, Sam. I know exactly what it does to you every time somebody gets close enough to that hole in your chest where your mother used to be. You'd forgive anybody anything if they promised to fill it. That's not what this is. Then what is it? Tommy straightened, spreading his hands. Because from where I'm standing it looks exactly like every con I've ever seen coming from a mile away, except this one's dressed up nicer because it comes with your actual mother attached. You want to know how easy that would be to fake if somebody really wanted to. A sob story, a convenient rescue, a pregnant woman. Nobody suspects because who would suspect a pregnant woman? Enough. Sam's voice came out sharper than he intended, sharp enough that Tommy actually stopped blinking, momentarily thrown by the edge in it. Sam exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face. I'm sorry. I know you're only doing this because you care. But I need you to hear me. She had $420, Tommy. Her entire wedding fund. She gave it to a stranger dying on the sidewalk outside a hospital 3 days after her fiancé emptied their savings and walked out on her. That's not the profile of somebody running a long con. That's the profile of somebody who doesn't know how to be anything other than kind, even when it costs her everything she has left. Or it's the profile of somebody smart enough to know exactly what story would work on a man who spent 20 years looking for his mother. Tommy's voice had gone quieter now, less combative, edged instead with something that sounded underneath the frustration, almost like fear. I watched my own uncle lose his house to a woman who told him exactly what he wanted to hear for 2 years before she disappeared with everything he had left. I'm not saying Sophie's like that. I'm saying I've seen good men get taken apart by people who understood exactly which wound to press on. And you've got the biggest, deepest wound of anybody I've ever known. Sam was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost its sharpness, settling instead into something tired and honest. You might be right to be careful. I know you're only saying this because of everything we came up through together, but I need you to at least meet her before you decide what she is. Fine. Tommy straightened his tie, some of the tension in his shoulders easing, though his eyes remained watchful. I'll meet her. But I'm running a background check either way, Sam. Full workup. I'm not doing my job if I don't, and you know it. Run whatever you need to run, Sam said. I'm not worried. Sophie found the two of them still standing in the study an hour later, when she came looking for Sam with Dorothy's untouched breakfast tray balanced carefully in her hands, worried the older woman had slept through another meal. She paused in the doorway immediately, sensing the tension still hanging in the air like smoke that had not quite cleared. I can come back, she offered. No. Sam crossed the room, some of the strain visibly leaving his shoulders at the sight of her. Sophie, this is Tommy Briggs, my oldest friend, our chief operating officer. Tommy studied her for a long moment, before extending his hand, his grip firm, his eyes doing the careful, unhurried work of a man accustomed to reading people for a living. Miss Callahan, Sophie's fine. She shook his hand steady, despite the obvious scrutiny, and something in her calm, unhurried directness seemed briefly to catch him off guard. I'll be straight with you, Tommy said. I don't know you. I don't know your intentions. I've watched a lot of people try to get close to Sam over the years, and most of them wanted something. So I'm going to be looking into your background thoroughly, and I'm not going to apologize for it. Sophie did not flinch. Good, she said simply. Look into whatever you need to. You'll find a hospital job, a broken engagement, and about $11 in my checking account. I'm not hiding anything, Mr. Briggs, because I don't have anything to hide. Something flickered across Tommy's face, not quite trust, not yet, but a small, grudging recalculation, the beginning of an equation he had not expected to need adjusting. We'll see, he said, though the edge in his voice had softened by a fraction. After he left, Sophie set the breakfast tray down on the desk and turned to Sam, her expression thoughtful rather than wounded. He's not wrong to be careful, she said. If I were him, I'd probably be doing the exact same thing. You don't have to be gracious about it. I'm not being gracious. I'm being honest. She sat down slowly in the chair across from him, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach. Sam, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually hear it instead of trying to fix it with money. Okay. I can't keep living here like this. Not as a guest. Not as somebody being taken care of. She held his gaze steadily. I spent my whole life being told one way or another that I wasn't worth investing in, not by my parents, not by Kyle, not by half the people I've ever worked for. I need something that's mine. A real job. Something I earn, not something that's handed to me because your mother happens to be fond of me. Sam considered her for a long moment, something warm and quietly impressed moving behind his eyes. I actually need a personal coordinator for my mother's care and schedule, he said slowly. It's a real position. It comes with a real salary, benefits, all of it. I was going to post the opening this week regardless of any of this. Then post it, Sophie said, and I'll apply for it like anybody else would. Sam almost laughed, something loosening in his chest at the sheer stubborn integrity of her. A woman who had been handed a house key and a car, and turned both away, asking instead for the dignity of earning her place. You've got the job, he said. Not because of anything else. Because you're exactly the kind of person my mother needs looking after her, and because I don't think there's anybody I trust more to do it honestly. Sophie allowed herself finally a small, genuine smile. Then I accept, she said. On merit. Nothing else. Outside the study window, the winter sun had begun to climb higher over the frosted lawn, and somewhere down the hall, faint and cheerful, came the sound of Dorothy humming an old country song to herself, unaware for the moment of the quiet, careful negotiation taking place between the two people who had, without either of them quite realizing it, yet become the center of each other's healing. "Oh, sweetheart. Bless your heart. You actually think a job title makes you belong here. Let me guess. Mopped a few floors, batted your eyes at a lonely billionaire, and now you're playing dress-up as somebody important. It's almost cute if it wasn't so pathetic." The voice sliced across the marble lobby of Hastings' home and Hardware's corporate headquarters like a blade drawn slowly for effect. And Sophie Callahan turned from the reception desk to find a tall, striking woman in a cream-colored suit studying her the way a jeweler studies a stone, before deciding whether it is worth the trouble of appraising at all. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" Sophie asked, keeping her voice level despite the sudden familiar tightening in her chest. "Whitney Sinclair." The woman extended a hand adorned with a ring Sophie suspected cost more than a year of her old rent, though the gesture felt less like an introduction than a formality performed for the benefit of anyone watching. "My father sits on the board. I've known Sam since we were practically children, so you'll forgive me if I find it a little strange that a hospital janitor is suddenly walking these halls with an executive badge, playing companion to Dorothy Hastings like she's auditioning for a part in somebody's fairy tale." "I was hired to coordinate Dorothy's care and schedule," Sophie said evenly. "That's the job. There's no audition involved." "Is that what we're calling it now?" Whitney's smile did not reach her eyes. "You know, it's fascinating timing, don't you think? 20 years this family spends searching for that poor woman, and she just happens to turn up in the care of a broke pregnant stranger who happens to catch Sam's eye at exactly the right moment. Some people would call that a miracle. I call it a very well-timed opportunity." Sophie felt her pulse climb, felt the old exhausted urge to shrink, to apologize for taking up space. She had not asked to occupy the same instinct. Denise had trained into her over months of quiet cruelty, the same instinct Kyle had exploited. In a hospital corridor not 2 weeks earlier, she pressed it down. "I found Dorothy freezing outside a hospital and paid for her care with money I couldn't afford to lose," she said. "If you want to call that an opportunity, that says more about how you see the world than it does about me." Something flickered across Whitney's composed features, surprise perhaps that the woman in front of her had not simply wilted before it smoothed back into its usual polish. "We'll see how long that righteous little speech holds up," she said, "once people start looking a little closer at you." She turned on her heels, clicking sharply against the marble as she strode toward the elevator bank, leaving Sophie standing alone beneath the tall glass atrium with her heart hammering and her hands once again pressed flat and trembling against the strap of her bag. The rumors moved faster than Sophie expected. By the following afternoon, she had caught 2 junior staffers falling abruptly silent as she passed the break room, their eyes darting away with the particular guilt of people who had just been discussing someone behind her back. By the end of the week, a version of the story had taken firm root through the building's whispered network that Sophie Callahan had somehow orchestrated the entire discovery of Dorothy Hastings, that she had targeted the family deliberately, that a pregnant, unemployed woman simply did not stumble into that kind of fortune by accident. Sophie said nothing to Sam about it at first, unwilling to be the woman who came running to him with every slight, determined to prove to herself as much as to anyone else that she could stand on her own footing in this unfamiliar world. But standing on her own footing became considerably harder the day she walked into the executive dining room for lunch and found the room go quiet in that particular deliberate way that told her the silence had been about her. "There she is," a voice murmured, not quite low enough. "I heard she used to work nights scrubbing bedpans. Now she's got Sam Hastings wrapped around her finger. Must be nice. I heard the pregnancy might not even be enough." The word cut through the dining room with the flat, absolute authority Sophie had not yet heard Sam use, and every head turned toward the doorway where he now stood, jaw-tight, eyes moving slowly and deliberately across the room, cataloging faces the way a man commits something to memory for later use. "I don't know exactly what's been said in this building over the last week," Sam said, his voice carrying easily across the sudden, brittle silence. "But I'm going to say this once clearly, so there's no confusion going forward. Sophie Callahan found my mother freezing on a sidewalk and gave every dollar she had left in the world to save her life. She did that without knowing who my mother was, without expecting anything in return, at a moment when she herself had just been abandoned by the man she was supposed to marry." His gaze swept the room again, landing briefly pointedly on the 2 junior staffers who had gone very still near the coffee station. "If anyone in this building has a problem with the woman who did that, I'd like to hear it from you directly rather than in whispers behind her back. I suspect most of you won't have the nerve." Nobody spoke. "Good," Sam said. "Then we understand each other." He crossed the room to where Sophie stood, her face flushed with an emotion that was not quite embarrassment and not quite gratitude, but some tangled combination of both, and offered his arm with the easy, deliberate courtesy of a man who wanted every person in that room to see exactly where he stood. It was later that same afternoon in the quiet of Sam's office that Whitney found them both, her earlier composure, notably frayed at the edges, 2 spots of color high on her otherwise carefully powdered cheeks. "You humiliated me in front of the entire executive floor," she said, her voice tight over some janitor you've known for 2 weeks. "I corrected a lie," Sam said calmly, not looking up from the papers on his desk. "If it embarrassed you, Whitney, you might consider not participating in the lie in the first place." "Everyone always assumed we'd end up together eventually," Whitney said, and for a moment something almost vulnerable flickered beneath the fury, quickly buried again beneath a brittle practiced smile. "Our families, this company. And now you're throwing all of that away for a woman who scrubs floors for a living." "Nobody assumed that but you," Sam said finally, looking up, his voice quiet but unmistakably final. "I think it's time you understood that clearly before this goes any further." Whitney's mouth opened, then closed again, her carefully composed mask slipping for just an instant to reveal something colder and more calculating underneath, something that promised silently that this particular conversation was far from finished. She turned without another word and left the click of her heels fading down the corridor, and Sophie, watching from the doorway, felt a small, uneasy chill move through her that had nothing to do with the winter cold pressing against the office windows. "She's not going to let this go," Sophie said quietly once they were alone. "No," Sam admitted, some of the earlier firmness fading from his voice, replaced by something more careful, more watchful. "She's not the kind of person who does." Neither of them could have known, standing together in the fading afternoon light of that office, exactly how far Whitney Sinclair was willing to go to make certain she was not the one left standing outside looking in, nor how deep the roots of her resentment truly reached, tangled quietly, invisibly, into a wound in the Hastings family far older and far more painful than either of them yet understood. Charity care is a losing line item, plain and simple. These people aren't going to become paying customers, they're going to become permanent liabilities. Cut the funding. If a few of them fall through the cracks, that's unfortunate, but it's not our job to catch every stray that wanders into an emergency room. The recording crackled faintly through the laptop speakers, 6 years old, pulled from an archived board meeting buried 3 folders deep in a records request. Tommy Briggs had submitted under an assumed pretext, and for a long moment he simply sat there in the low light of his home office, staring at the paused waveform on the screen, feeling something cold settle into his stomach. He recognized the voice instantly. Younger, sharper at the edges, but unmistakably, Whitney Sinclair, speaking at a Mercy Grace General Hospital System board meeting, from a period when Tommy now remembered she had briefly held a senior administrative role before her father pulled her over to Hastings' home and hardware full-time. He had gone looking for something else entirely. Sam had asked him reluctantly to widen the background check beyond Sophie, a concession Tommy had extracted after their conversation in the study, insisting that if he was going to investigate one woman entering the family's orbit, was going to look at every angle, including the ones nobody wanted looked at. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, to find nothing on Whitney beyond old family gossip and a spoiled woman's sense of entitlement. He had not expected this. The charity care cuts Whitney had championed 6 years earlier had gutted indigent funding at 3 hospitals across the metro area: Mercy, Grace General. Among them, the same funding that Tommy now understood with a sick, sinking clarity might once have stood between an unidentified, feverish woman and a locked emergency room door. He thought of Dorothy, half frozen on a sidewalk, turned away by staff following policies Whitney herself had helped put in place. He thought of Sophie, emptying her last $420 into a system that should never have required it of her in the first place. He kept digging. It took 2 more days, and a favor called in from a contact at a records management firm who owed Tommy from a previous unrelated matter, before the second document surfaced an invoice dated nearly 4 years earlier from a private investigation firm in Street. Louis paid from a personal account belonging to Whitney Sinclair. The subject line, when Tommy finally pried the file open, made his hands go still on the keyboard. Subject: D. Hastings Status Inquiry Confidential. Tommy read it twice, then a third time, feeling the cold in his stomach spread up into his chest. 4 years ago, long before Dorothy had ever collapsed outside Mercy Grace General, long before anyone in the family had any reason to believe she might still be alive, Whitney had quietly commissioned a private search for her, not to help find her, not out of any charitable impulse. The report attached to the invoice detailed movements through 3 separate homeless outreach programs across the state, a woman matching Dorothy's description tracked and then deliberately left untouched. Subject remains unidentified within public systems. Recommend no further contact pending client instruction. Tommy sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, piecing it together with the slow, sickened clarity of a man watching a puzzle resolve into a picture he wished he had never assembled. Whitney had known, or at least strongly suspected, that the woman drifting through those outreach programs was Sam's mother, and rather than reunite a grieving son with the one piece of family he had spent 2 decades searching for, she had buried the information, calculating coldly, patiently, that a Sam Hastings still haunted by an unresolved loss was a Sam Hastings more vulnerable, more likely eventually to settle for the familiar comfort of the woman who had always been positioned at his side. He thought of Sam in that locked childhood bedroom carrying a wound. Tommy himself had watched him carry for over 2 decades, and something in him went very quiet and very still with anger. It was past midnight when Tommy arrived unannounced at the Hastings estate, the printouts clutched in a folder under his arm, prepared to deliver the news to Sam directly. But the house was dark and silent when he let himself in through the side entrance with the key he had carried for 15 years. And it was the faint murmur of voices from down the hall, not raised, not urgent, but low and careful, that drew him toward the guest wing instead. He stopped just short of the open doorway. Inside, in the dim glow of a single bedside lamp, Dorothy sat upright in bed, disoriented and frightened, her thin hands twisting at the edge of her blanket, murmuring something about a locked door and a car she couldn't find. Sophie sat beside her in a chair, pulled close, still in the same plain clothes she had worn all day, her hand resting gently over Dorothy's, her voice a low, steady murmur of reassurance that carried no trace of impatience, no glance toward a clock, no visible awareness that anyone might be watching, or that there was anything to be gained from the performance of kindness at this particular hour. "You're safe, Dorothy. You're home. Nobody's going to lock any doors on you here. I've got you." "Sammy," Dorothy whispered, still caught somewhere in the fog of memory. "I have to find Sammy." "He's just down the hall," Sophie said softly. "He's safe, too. You found him. Do you remember? You found him, and he's not going anywhere." Tommy stood frozen in the shadowed corridor, watching a woman who believed herself entirely unobserved sit patiently through the small, unglamorous hours of another person's fear, offering nothing louder than steadiness, expecting nothing, it's in return. But the older woman's eventual quiet return, to sleep. There was no audience here to perform for, no Sam to impress, no board to sway, no reward waiting on the other side of this particular act of care. There was only an exhausted, pregnant woman choosing again in the middle of the night to be gentle with someone who needed it. Something in Tommy's chest, guarded and suspicious for 22 years on his best friend's behalf, finally quietly gave way. He waited until Dorothy had drifted back into an easy, untroubled sleep, and Sophie had risen to slip out into the hallway before he stepped forward, startling her. "Mr. Briggs." Sophie pressed a hand to her chest, catching her breath. "You scared me half to death." "I owe you an apology," Tommy said, and the words came out rougher than he intended, thick with something he rarely let show. "I've spent 2 weeks treating you like a threat to watch. I just stood there and watched you take care of a woman who has no idea you're doing it at midnight with nothing to gain from it." He shook his head slowly. "I was wrong about you. I need you to know that." Sophie studied him for a moment, surprise softening into something gentler. "You were trying to protect your friend," she said. "I can't fault you for that. There's something else." Tommy's expression turned grim again, the folder under his arm suddenly heavy in a way it had not been a moment ago. "I need to talk to Sam. Tonight. It's about Whitney, and it's about his mother, and it's not going to be easy for him to hear." He hesitated, then added quieter, "I think I'm going to need you there too when I tell him. He's going to need somebody in that room who isn't going to just hand him a solution and walk away." Sophie's face had gone pale in the dim hallway light, some instinct already bracing itself for whatever weight Tommy was about to set down between them. "Do you have any idea what you've done to this family's name? I flew home from Chicago because a colleague texted me a tabloid headline calling my brother's girlfriend, the janitor, Cinderella. Do you understand how that sounds, Sam? How it makes 40 years of building this company look, when the story everyone's telling isn't about hardware stores or shareholder value. It's about my brother falling for a woman who scrubs hospital floors for a living." Catherine Hastings Voss swept into the study without knocking, her coat still damp from the drive and a folded newspaper clutched in one hand like a weapon she intended to use. Sam looked up slowly from the desk where he and Tommy had been sitting for most of the night. The folder of evidence about Whitney still spread open between them, and for a moment the exhaustion in his face made him look to his sister's eyes unrecognizably young. "Catherine, it's 5 in the morning. I don't care what time it is." She dropped the newspaper onto the desk, the headline glaring up at all three of them in bold black type. "Billionaire's missing mother. Found sparks fly. Between CEO and hospital janitor who saved her." This is what's circulating, Sam. Not the story of mom finally coming home. Not 20 years of searching finally paying off. A tabloid romance about a broke pregnant nobody who happened to be in the right place at the right time. "Her name is Sophie, Sam," said his voice quiet, but with an edge Catherine did not seem to register. "And she's not a story, Catherine. She saved Mom's life. I'm sure she's very sweet." Catherine's tone made it clear she believed no such thing. "But Sweet doesn't run a company, Sam. And Sweet doesn't protect a family fortune from being picked apart by every opportunist who reads that headline and gets ideas of her own. I've spent 15 years helping you build something out of nothing, and I am not going to stand by while some woman we met 2 weeks ago becomes the center of a story that makes this entire family look like a punchline." Tommy shifted in his seat, glancing at Sam, clearly debating whether this was the moment to lay the folder about Whitney on the desk and change the entire shape of the conversation. Sam caught the look and gave a small, tight shake of his head. Not yet. There was too much already unraveling in this room without adding a second collapse before either of them had steadied himself for the first. "I'd like to speak with her," Catherine said, straightening some of her fury, folding itself back into cold, practical resolve. Alone. She found Sophie an hour later in the small breakfast room off the kitchen, the pale morning light barely beginning to warm the frost-covered windows, a cup of decaffeinated tea cooling untouched in front of her. Sophie looked up as Catherine entered, and something in the older woman's expression, controlled, deliberate, armored, told her immediately that this was not a conversation that had come to make her feel welcome. "Miss Callahan." Catherine sat down across from her without being invited, setting a slim leather folder on the table between them. "I'll be direct because I think you strike me as someone who would prefer that to flattery. I don't know you. I don't know your intentions. What I do know is that my brother has spent his entire adult life building something extraordinary out of a childhood that nearly destroyed him, and I am not willing to watch that unravel because of a relationship that started 2 weeks ago, under circumstances that could very charitably be called unusual." "I understand you're worried about him," Sophie said carefully. "I would be too in your position. Then you'll understand this." Catherine opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. A check already filled out, the amount printed in careful, deliberate handwriting: $5 million. "This is yours. No strings, no lawyers, no conditions beyond one. You take this, and you leave quietly tonight, and you let my brother and my mother remember you as a kind stranger who helped once, rather than as a complication that cost this family everything it spent 20 years trying to hold together." Sophie stared at the check for a long moment, the number almost too large to hold any real meaning, an abstraction rather than a sum of money. More she understood distantly than she would likely earn in the rest of her working life, combined. She thought of the cold apartment she had left 3 weeks ago. She thought of the wedding dress still hanging behind a door. She thought of the $420 she had handed over, without a second thought, to save a stranger's life, and of every insult that decision had earned her since. She picked up the check, and for one long suspended moment Catherine's expression flickered with something that might have been relief. Then Sophie tore it neatly in half and set the pieces down on the table between them. "I love your brother," she said quietly, evenly, meeting Catherine's eyes without flinching. "I didn't plan to. I didn't come here looking for it. But I do, and I'm not going to take money to pretend I don't, because that would make every single thing your family has ever said about people like me true. That we can be bought. That kindness is just a transaction waiting for the right offer." She pushed the torn pieces gently across the table. "I gave away every dollar I had to save your mother's life without knowing who she was. I'm not going to sell what came after for $5 million more." Catherine sat very still, staring at the torn check, something complicated moving behind her carefully composed features. Not quite shame, not yet, but the first faint crack in the certainty she had walked into the room carrying. "You understand what you're turning down," she said finally, though the edge in her voice had dulled considerably. "I understand exactly what I'm turning down," Sophie said. "I've lived without money my entire life, Miss Hastings Voss. I know precisely what it can and can't buy. It can't buy Sam feeling worth loving. It can't buy your mother finally sleeping through the night without waking up frightened. And it can't buy me becoming somebody I'm not, just because it would make your family more comfortable." For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The silence stretching out between them, filled only with the faint tick of the kitchen clock and the low hum of the refrigerator down the hall. Catherine finally rose, gathering the torn halves of the check with hands that were not quite as steady as they had been when she'd walked in. "I misjudged you," she said. The words clipped unpracticed, clearly costing her something to say aloud. "I don't say that easily." "I know," Sophie said. "I don't need you to like me, Miss Hastings Voss. I just need you to eventually see that I'm not the threat you came here believing I was." Catherine paused at the doorway, glancing back at her with an expression Sophie could not quite read, something that might with time soften into respect. "There's something else happening in this house," she said slowly. "Something Sam and Tommy were discussing when I arrived. I don't know what it is yet, but I intend to find out." She left without another word, and Sophie sat alone in the pale morning light for a long time afterward, her tea gone fully cold, her heart still pounding with the particular exhausted adrenaline of a woman who had just refused more money than she would likely ever see again in her life, and had not, for one single moment, wanted it back. She did not yet know what Tommy had found in the small hours of that same night, nor how completely it was about to upend everything the Hastings family believed about the 20 years they had already survived. But sitting there watching the frost slowly melt from the window panes as the sun climbed higher over the Kansas City skyline, Sophie understood with a quiet and unshakable certainty that whatever came next, she intended to face it standing exactly where she stood now, beside the people who had, against every reasonable expectation, become the closest thing to family she had left. She had it hidden in her sock drawer, wrapped in a hand towel like she thought nobody would ever think to look there. "I always said there was something not right about a woman who shows up out of nowhere with a story that convenient. Guess we finally know exactly what kind of person we let into this house." The head housekeeper's voice carried flat and cold across the marble entryway, loud enough to reach every corner of the gathered household, and Sophie Callahan stood frozen at the top of the staircase with her hand pressed white-knuckled against the banister, staring down at the small velvet box now, sitting open on the entry table, the Hastings family's diamond bracelet, a piece Dorothy had once described in a quiet evening conversation as the last gift her own grandmother had ever given her. "That's not possible," Sophie said, her voice cracking despite every effort to hold it steady. "I never touched that bracelet. I didn't even know where it was kept." "The safe combination was changed 2 weeks ago," the housekeeper said. Arms crossed, her expression carved from something hard and unforgiving. "Only a handful of people had access to the new one. You were one of them, Miss Callahan, on account of your work with Mrs. Hastings' jewelry for special occasions." Dorothy stood near the base of the stairs, one hand pressed against her chest, her face pale with a confusion and hurt that cut Sophie far deeper than any accusation could have. "Sophie," she said, her voice small and uncertain, in a way Sophie had not heard since the fever-soaked nights in her own small apartment. "Tell me this isn't true." "It isn't," Sophie said, descending the stairs slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. "Dorothy, I swear to you I would never." "The evidence says otherwise," Catherine cut in, arriving from the hallway with an expression that had over the past days softened toward Sophie, and now in the space of a single accusation, hardened all over again. "I want to believe you. God help me, I was starting to. But a stolen family heirloom found hidden in your room isn't exactly a small misunderstanding." Whitney appeared then, drawn by the commotion, positioning herself at the edge of the gathered staff, with an expression of carefully manufactured shock, one hand pressed delicately to her collarbone. "I can't believe this," she murmured, just loud enough to be heard by everyone in the entryway. "I hate to say I saw this coming, but honestly, a woman shows up out of nowhere, worms her way into this family's trust, and now a priceless heirloom goes missing. I think we all know exactly what kind of person does something like that." Sophie turned toward her sharply, some instinct sparking beneath the panic and humiliation flooding through her chest, but she had no proof, nothing beyond a feeling she could not yet articulate, and the weight of every eye in that entryway, pressing down on her, made it impossible to organize the thought into anything solid enough to speak aloud. "I need to see Sam," she said instead, her voice shaking. "He's in a meeting with the family attorney," Catherine said. "About this, presumably once security finishes their report." Something in Sophie's chest gave way at that, not a collapse exactly, but a quiet, exhausted resignation, the particular defeat of a woman who has spent her entire life being disbelieved, and has finally, despite every hope she had allowed herself to build over these past weeks, run out of the strength to keep fighting for a place at a table that seemed determined again and again to prove she did not belong there. "Then I'll pack my things," she said quietly, "and I'll go." She was folding the few clothes she had brought with her hands, trembling tears finally slipping free now that there was no one left in the room to witness them, when the door opened without a knock and Sam stepped inside, his face pale, a tablet clutched in one hand. "Stop," he said. "Please, don't pack anything. Sam, they found it in my room. I don't have any way to prove. You don't need to prove anything." He crossed the room quickly, setting the tablet down on the bed between them, the security footage already paused on the screen. "I reviewed the archived footage the moment I heard what happened. I should have done it before I even let anyone accuse you of anything." Sophie looked down at the frozen image, a narrow hallway camera angle time-stamped 3 nights earlier, deep in the small hours of the morning. A figure moved through the frame, moving carefully, deliberately glancing over one shoulder, before slipping into the guest wing corridor that led to Sophie's room. "Play it," Sophie whispered. Sam did. The footage rolled forward in grainy, silent clarity, and there, unmistakable even in the poor lighting, was Whitney Sinclair, a small velvet box clutched in one gloved hand, disappearing through Sophie's door and emerging again less than a minute later, empty-handed, smoothing her hair back into place before walking briskly out of frame. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sophie sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, her legs finally giving out beneath the sheer relief and fury crashing through her at once, and Sam stood over her, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides in a way that told her exactly how much restraint it was costing him not to storm down the planks for him. Hallway, and confront Whitney that very instant. "She's been planning this," Sam said quietly. "Not just the bracelet, all of it. Tommy's still going through everything, but between what he found about the funding cuts and the investigator's report on my mother and now this," he shook his head slowly, something bleak and exhausted moving across his face. "I don't even fully understand yet how far back this goes. I need you to fix this," Sophie said, her voice still unsteady. "Not for me, for Dorothy. She looked at me tonight like I'd broken her heart." "I will," Sam said. "Tonight, in front of everyone who watched them accuse you." He knelt down in front of her, taking both her hands in his expression fierce in a way she had not yet seen from him. "I need you to know something, Sophie. I believed you before I even watched this footage. Not because I needed proof, because I know exactly what kind of person you are, and it isn't this." Sophie felt something in her chest finally loosen, the tight panicked knot of the last hour beginning slowly to unravel. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet." Sam rose, his expression darkening again as he glanced toward the door, toward the long hallway that led back to the entryway where Whitney had stood only an hour earlier, wearing her borrowed shock like a costume. "There's something else Tommy needs to tell me tonight too. Something about my mother and about what happened in the years before Sophie ever found her. I think it's time this entire family finally learned the truth, all of it, whatever it costs to hear." Outside the window, the winter night had settled fully over the estate, the bare oak trees along the drive standing silent and still beneath a sky thick with cold, distant stars, and somewhere down that same long hallway, unaware of reckoning gathering quietly against her, Whitney Sinclair sat alone, in a guest room, satisfied for the moment that her plan had worked exactly as she intended. She did not yet know that the ground beneath her had already silently begun to shift. "She's gone, boy, and she's not coming back for you. You understand me? A mother who really wanted her son would have found a way. She didn't want to. Don't you ever ask me about her again." The words were written in a hand Sam Hastings recognized instantly, even faded and cramped across the yellowed page. His father's handwriting, blunt and slanted, pressed hard enough into the paper that the ink had bled slightly at the edges of certain letters, the way it always had when Walter Hastings wrote drunk. Sam sat on the cold concrete floor of the estate's old storage basement, a single bare bulb swinging faintly overhead, a battered wooden box open on his lap, and for a long moment he simply stared at the sentence, feeling something in his chest cave inward, like a structure finally giving way, after decades of quiet, invisible stress fractures. He had gone down to the basement that night looking for nothing in particular, some errand of restless, grief-stricken energy after the confrontation over the bracelet, a need to move his body somewhere. The house's tension could not follow him. He had found the box wedged behind a stack of his father's old tools, untouched, since the estate had been renovated years earlier, its small brass lock rusted nearly shut. It had taken him almost 20 minutes with a screwdriver to force it open. He wished now that he had left it exactly where it was. Beneath the letter lay a thin folder of papers official in their formatting, county seals, stamped faintly across each page, guardianship records dated the same year his mother had disappeared. Sam's hands were not steady as he lifted them into the dim light, and it took him several long minutes of reading, rereading, before the words on the page began to assemble themselves into a shape his mind could fully accept. A caseworker's signature notarized certifying that Dorothy Hastings had voluntarily relinquished custody and left the state unreachable, unwilling to be contacted. A second document beneath it, handwritten and unsigned. Clearly a draft, the same account, the same claims, but with several lines crossed out and rewritten in a different, more careful hand, as though someone had practiced the lie before committing it to an official form. And beneath that, tucked into the folder's inner pocket, a single hospital admission record from a facility 2 counties over, dated only 3 days after his mother's disappearance. The patient name had been redacted with heavy black marker, but the admitting notes remained legible. Female, mid-30s, multiple contusions, fractured wrist evidence consistent with sustained physical assault. Patient reports attempting to leave a domestic situation with a minor child. Reports being physically prevented from doing so. Sam read the line 4 times before the room around him seemed to tilt, the bare bulb swinging gently overhead, casting long swinging shadows across the concrete walls, his own breath suddenly loud and ragged in his ears. She had not left him. She had tried to take him with her. The story he had carried for 20 years. The story his father had poured into him, night after night, drink after drink, until it had calcified into something Sam had stopped questioning entirely, was not simply incomplete. It was a lie constructed deliberately on paper, with a bribed signature and a rewritten draft, to erase every trace of what had actually happened on the night his mother vanished from his life. He did not remember afterward climbing the basement stairs. He did not remember crossing the length of the house or finding his way to the guest wing, or standing outside Sophie's door with the folder still clutched against his chest like something that might otherwise shatter. He only remembered with sudden and overwhelming clarity the door opening and Sophie's face still soft with sleep immediately sharpening with alarm at whatever she saw in his expression. Sam. What happened? He could not answer at first. He simply held the folder out to her, his hands shaking too badly to keep it steady, and sank down onto the floor of the hallway, as though his legs had finally, after 20 years, given out beneath a weight he had carried without ever once setting it down. Sophie read quickly, her own face draining of color as the pieces assembled themselves, and then she was on the floor beside him, the folder set carefully aside, her arms coming around him without hesitation, without a single word of the careful managed comfort people so often reached for in moments like this. She didn't leave me, Sam, said the words breaking apart as they left him 20 years of grief, finally cracking open all at once. He beat her, Sophie. He beat her so badly she ended up in a hospital, and then he paid someone to make it look like she chose to go. He let me grow up hating her. He let me spend my whole life thinking I wasn't worth staying for, when the truth is she tried. She actually tried. I know, Sophie said softly, holding him tighter as his shoulders began to shake as the composed, careful billionaire, who had built an empire out of a childhood wound, finally allowed himself for the first time since he was 7 years old, fall apart completely. I know, Sam. I've got you. There was nothing to fix in that moment, and Sophie did not try. She did not offer explanations for a dead man's cruelty, did not search for silver linings in a lie that had cost a mother and son 20 years. Neither of them could ever recover. She simply held him there on the cold hallway floor in the deep, silent hours before dawn, letting him weep the way. A person weeps only once or twice in an entire lifetime, completely without restraint, without the careful management of an audience, while the old house settled quietly around them, indifferent to the reckoning finally taking place within its walls. She spent almost 20 years looking for me, Sam said eventually, his voice hoarse and raw. Broken, alone, sick, sleeping outside in the cold, and the entire time I thought she'd simply decided I wasn't worth the trouble. I let that belief shape everything. Every deal I made. Every person I kept at arm's length. I built a company to prove something to a woman I thought had never once looked back, and she was out there the whole time looking for nothing else. She found you, Sophie said gently. In the end, that's what matters. She found you and I found her, and none of that had to happen the way it did, but it happened anyway, and you're both still here. Sam pulled back slightly, searching her face in the dim hallway light, something in his expression shifting from raw grief into something quieter, steadier, beginning carefully to take root. You didn't try to make this smaller than it is, he said. Everyone in my life has always tried to make my pain smaller, manageable. You just let it be exactly as big as it actually is. Because it is that big, Sophie said simply. Pretending otherwise wouldn't help you. It would just teach you to keep hiding it the way you've been hiding it in that locked room down the hall for 20 years. They sat together on the hallway floor for a long time after that, the folder of papers resting closed beside them, the first faint gray light of morning beginning to creep in along the edges of the tall windows at the end of Corridor. Sam did not let go of Sophie's hand, and she did not pull it away. And somewhere in the quiet, unhurried passing of that long, difficult night, something between them settled into place that neither of them would ever again need to. Question not gratitude, not simple attraction, but the particular hard-won trust of two people who had each in their own way learned exactly what it cost to be truly seen, and had chosen finally to offer that same unguarded seeing to one another. When morning fully broke over the estate, gold and pale across the frost-covered lawn, Sam rose slowly, pulling Sophie up with him, the folder held firmly now in one steady hand rather than clutched against his chest like a wound. "I need to tell my mother," he said. "And my sister. Today. All of it." "I'll be there," Sophie said. "Whatever you need." "I know," Sam said, and for the first time since the box had opened in that cold basement the night before, something like peace moved quietly across his face. "That's exactly why I'm not afraid to do it. Honestly, I don't know why we're all still standing around discussing this. The evidence speaks for itself. That woman stole a family heirloom, and instead of calling the police like any sane family would, you're all sitting here debating her feelings. Some of us actually care about protecting what this family has built, even if the rest of you have lost your nerve." Whitney Sinclair's voice rang out crisp and confident across the great room where the entire household had gathered at Sam's request. Dorothy seated near the fire with Catherine beside her, Tommy standing near the window with arms crossed, Sophie a few steps behind. Sam, her hands folded, tightly in front of her. Whitney stood near the center of the room, chin lifted, entirely unaware that the ground beneath her had already quietly given way. "You're right," Sam said, evenly crossing to the large screen mounted above the fireplace, a tablet in his hand. "Somebody in this family did steal that bracelet. I agree completely that it's time we stopped debating and simply looked at the facts." He connected the tablet to the screen, and the room fell silent as the security footage began to play, grainy, unmistakable, time-stamped 3 nights earlier. Whitney's confident expression flickered the moment the image resolved into focus. A slender figure in a familiar coat, gloved hands, a small velvet box carried carefully down the guest wing corridor, disappearing into Sophie's room, and emerging a minute later empty-handed. The color drained slowly from Whitney's face as the footage played out in full, the room around her utterly silent, except for the low, tinny audio of her own footsteps captured on camera. "That's," she started, her voice thinner, now stripped of its earlier certainty. "That footage has been altered. It has to be. I would never. Save it, Whitney." Tommy's voice cut across the room, flat and final, and he stepped forward, setting a second folder down on the coffee table with a deliberate, heavy motion. "While we're clearing the air, there's more. 6 years ago, you personally approved cutting charity care funding at 3 Missouri hospitals, including the one where Dorothy Hastings was eventually found freezing outside an emergency room. 4 years ago, you paid a private investigator to track an unidentified homeless woman through outreach programs across this state, a woman whose description matches Dorothy Hastings exactly. And when your investigator confirmed it, you told him not to make contact." He let the words settle, watching Whitney's composure crack further with each sentence. "You knew, Whitney, or you suspected strongly enough to look, and instead of bringing Sam's mother home, you buried it because a grieving, unresolved Sam was easier to manage than a healed one." The room had gone deathly quiet. Dorothy's hand had risen slowly to her mouth, her eyes wide and stricken, fixed on the woman standing in the center of the great room she had, until moments ago, considered a fixture of her son's world. "That's not," Whitney's voice cracked, the polish finally completely gone. "You don't understand. I never meant for her to be hurt. I needed time. I needed Sam to still need someone. And every year that passed without his mother, that was still me. I wasn't going to be the reason she came home to somebody who'd already moved on." "You let a sick, elderly woman sleep outside in the cold for years," Sam said, his voice low and controlled in a way that carried more weight than shouting ever could, "because it was convenient for your plans. And when that finally caught up to you, you stole from my family and tried to destroy the one person who actually saved her rather than admit any of it." He shook his head slowly. "I don't think there's anything left to discuss, Whitney. Security will escort you out. My legal team will be in touch about the funding records and the theft. I'd strongly recommend cooperating." It was Tommy who delivered the final blow, almost as an afterthought, pulling one last document from the folder. "One more thing. IT flagged unusual data activity from your credentials over the past month. Internal cost structures, supplier contracts, pricing models, all funneled to an external account traced back to Coleridge Retail Group. I believe that's the competitor your father's been quietly courting for a board seat once this family's out of the way." He set the paper down. "That's corporate espionage, Whitney. That's not a family matter anymore. That's a federal one. Whitney said nothing further. Two members of the household security team stepped forward at Sam's small, tired nod, and she was led from the room without another word, her earlier composure entirely stripped away, replaced by something small and frightened that none of them had ever seen from her before. The silence that followed her departure was heavy thick, with everything that had just been said, and everything still left to absorb. It was Catherine who finally broke it, rising slowly from her seat and crossing the room to where Dorothy sat, still visibly shaken, tears tracking silently down her weathered face. "Mom." Catherine's voice cracked on the word, unfamiliar and raw, and she sank to her knees in front of her mother's chair, taking both of Dorothy's hands in hers. "I spent 20 years thinking you chose to leave us. I said things about you I can never take back. I let myself believe the worst, because it was easier than sitting with the not knowing." Her composure, so carefully maintained through every difficult conversation of the past weeks, finally broke completely. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't fight harder to find you." Dorothy pulled her daughter into her arms, both women weeping, now 2 decades of grief and misunderstanding, finally beginning slowly, painfully to unknot itself in the quiet warmth of the great room's fireplace light. Sam stood watching them for a long moment before turning to Sophie, who had remained quietly near the edge of the room throughout the entire confrontation, giving the family the space to have this reckoning without inserting herself into it. He crossed to her, now taking her hand. "You didn't have to stay for all of that," he said quietly. "I wanted to," Sophie said. "This is your family healing something that's been broken for 20 years. That's not something to walk away from. It's your family too now," Sam said, and something in the simple, unguarded certainty of the statement made Sophie's breath catch. "Whatever this is between us, Sophie, I don't want to spend another day pretending it's anything less than exactly what it's become." Behind them, Dorothy looked up from her daughter's embrace, wiping her eyes, and caught the moment passing between Sam and Sophie, with an expression of quiet, unmistakable joy. "Sammy," she said, her voice still thick with tears, but bright now with something warmer underneath. "I believe there's something you've been meaning to ask this young woman for quite some time now." Sam glanced at his mother, then back at Sophie, and for the first time in longer than either of them could easily measure, the smile that crossed his face carried no trace of the guarded, careful distance he had spent 20 years perfecting. It was simply entirely happy. "Not tonight," he said softly, still holding Sophie's hand. "Tonight is for my family. But soon. I promise you that." Outside the tall windows of the great room, the last of the winter frost was finally beginning to thaw against the pale afternoon sun, and inside, gathered together in the firelight, a mother restored, a daughter forgiven, a friend proven true, and a woman who had once had nothing left to give but her own stubborn kindness, now standing at the very center of it all. The Hastings family, broken for 2 long decades, had finally fully begun to come home to itself. The garden behind the Hastings estate had never looked quite like this before. Strings of small white lights woven through the bare winter branches, a scattering of folding chairs arranged in careful rows facing a simple wooden arch. Beneath it, waiting with his hands clasped tightly together to keep them from shaking, stood Sam Hastings, dressed not in one of his tailored business suits, but in a plain charcoal jacket, his father's old work boots polished but unmistakably present beneath the cuff of his trousers. It had been several months since the night the locked box in the basement had changed everything he understood about his own life. Months of slow, deliberate healing, Dorothy regaining color in her cheeks and strength in her hands, finishing at last the pale yellow blanket she had begun in a small, cold apartment across town. Catherine visiting every weekend, now patient and present, in a way she had never quite managed to be before. Determined to make up for 20 years of misplaced grief, with 20 years, however many she had left, of showing up. Tommy standing now at Sam's right shoulder beneath the wedding arch, no longer a skeptic keeping careful watch over his oldest friend, but a man who had become, in the quiet, unglamorous months since that midnight confession in the hallway, something close to family himself. When Sophie appeared at the far end of the garden path, there was no elaborate designer gown, no borrowed dress taken in at the waist with a needle and thread out of necessity rather than choice. She wore something simple and warm, her hand resting lightly against the small, gentle curve where weeks earlier she had given birth to a daughter, a girl with her mother's steady eyes, and Dorothy insisted her grandfather's stubborn chin, though nobody in the family minded that particular inheritance nearly as much as they once might have. Sam did not wait for her to reach the arch. He met her halfway down the path, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly across the small, hushed gathering. "I used to think love was something you had to earn," he said. I spent 20 years building an empire trying to prove I deserved it. You never once asked me to prove anything. You just stayed. In a locked room. In a hallway at midnight. In every version of me you've ever met, the broken ones and the healed ones both. He reached into his jacket and withdrew. Not a jeweler's box, but a small, simple gold band. His mother's own wedding ring. The only possession Dorothy had managed to keep through nearly 20 years of loss. This is the only thing my mother carried with her, through every hard year she spent looking for me. I can't think of anything more fitting to give the woman who finally brought us both home. Sophie's eyes filled, and when she spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears. I didn't come into your life to save you, she said. I came into it because kindness was the only thing I had left to give, and it turned out to be enough. Watching you learn to believe that you were always worth staying for, that's been the greatest privilege of my life. They were married as the last light of the afternoon turned gold over the garden. Dorothy weeping openly in the front row with Catherine's arm around her shoulders. Tommy serving as best man with a grin that had over the months entirely replaced his old wariness, and somewhere near the back, quietly invited at Sophie's own insistence, a nurse and a doctor from Mercy Grace General, who had shown her nothing but kindness on the hardest night of her life. Justice in its own quiet way arrived not long after. Sam, now one of the hospital system's largest philanthropic donors, requested a private meeting with the board, and without raising his voice, without theatrics, simply laid out the pattern of cruelty Denise Kowalski had shown toward vulnerable patients and exhausted staff alike over her many years. There, she was let go within the week. The Second Chance Fund, once a quiet initiative buried in a corporate filing, was expanded into a national program renamed Dorothy's Door, dedicated to helping families escape domestic violence and homelessness with the same steady, unconditional support Sophie had once offered a stranger with nothing but a hospital blanket and a warm cup of water. The emergency wing at Mercy Grace General, where Dorothy had first been carried in from the rain, was renovated and rededicated in her name, a small brass plaque near the entrance, reading simply, "For every person who has ever needed someone to stop and see them." On a quiet evening not long after Sam stood on the back porch of the estate with his daughter asleep against his shoulder, watching Sophie and Dorothy work together in the garden, laughing over some small ordinary joke neither of them bothered to explain to him, he thought not for the first time of the 7-year-old boy in the locked room down the hall, certain he had never been worth staying for, and felt at long last the quiet, settled peace of a man who had finally fully let that old belief go. "You changed everything," he murmured to his daughter, too soft for anyone else to hear. "Both of you did." And that, dear friends, is where we leave the Hastings family, not with an ending exactly, but with a beginning built on the simple, stubborn truth that carried Sophie Callahan through the darkest night of her life, that kindness given freely, without any expectation of return, has a way of finding its way back to us, often from directions we never could have predicted. This story reminds us of a few simple truths worth carrying into our own lives. That a person's worth is never measured by the size of their bank account, but by the size of their heart in the moments when no one is watching. That the wounds we carry from childhood do not have to define the rest of our story, if we are brave enough to finally open that locked door and let someone stand beside us in the dark. That real love does not try to fix another person's pain, but simply stays close enough to help them carry it. And that even in our lowest, coldest, most hopeless moments, choosing compassion over bitterness is never wasted, even when it feels at the time like it might cost us everything we have left. Now I would love to hear from you. What lesson did you take away from Sophie and Sam's story? Was it the reminder that kindness always finds its way back to us? The importance of forgiving the people who hurt us once we finally understand the whole truth? Or perhaps, simply that it is never too late for a broken family to heal? Write it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I would be so grateful to hear which part of this story touched your heart the most. If this story moved you the way it moved me while telling it, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear its message today. Leave a comment below and subscribe so you never miss the next story. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and for letting these characters into your heart. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and I will see you again in the next video.